they are not as happy as you were led to believe. If you have been staring at that new relationship, scrolling, replaying, wondering how someone who harmed you can look so fine, let me interrupt the spiral with one steady sentence. What looks like peace is often just a performance with good lighting, because a narcissist does not enter a new relationship healed. They enter it hungry. And hunger can smile. Hunger can buy gifts. Hunger can post pictures. Hunger can hold hands in public. But hunger cannot build a home. And sooner or later, what is hollow begins to echo. You may feel the weight of the unfairness. They lied. They used. They broke trust. And now they appear to be rewarded with someone new. That is where faith is tested, not in the obvious darkness, but in the confusing brightness that seems to bless the wrong person. But Scripture is clear about something this world forgets. God is not mocked. What is sown will be reaped, not always quickly, not always publicly, but inevitably. And divine judgment is often not a thunderclap. Sometimes it is God allowing a person to live inside the consequences of their own character until the mask becomes a cage. That is why this message is not revenge, it is discernment. The new supply is not evidence of a new heart. It is often evidence of a deeper avoidance, an attempt to outrun accountability by changing the stage while keeping the same script. So when you see them moving on, do not confuse movement with progress. Some people run in circles for years and call it a journey. The narcissist brings the same emptiness into every fresh beginning, and the emptiness always demands payment. You do not need to chase proof. You only need to recognize patterns. And the first pattern is simple but revealing. They cannot rest inside what they claim to have. Now, watch the first sign. They must keep persuading themselves that this new story is real. Sign 1. They have to keep convincing themselves. A heart that is truly secure does not need to rehearse its happiness. It does not need to keep re-announcing its new beginning, as if words can pour concrete under a cracked foundation. But with the narcissist, that is exactly what happens, because the relationship is not held together by covenant, character, or truth. It is held together by narrative. This is the first crucial sign the narcissist is already miserable with the new supply. They must keep persuading themselves that this new story is real. You can feel the strain in the way they cling to symbols. They rush milestones, broadcast certainty, and speak as though they are trying to silence an inner witness that will not stop whispering. This is not solid. This is not safe. This will not last. And why does that whisper grow louder? Because the narcissist is not seeking love, at least not love as Scripture defines it. Love rejoices with the truth. Love bears, believes, hopes, endures. But the narcissist's version of love is often a transaction. Admiration exchanged for approval, obedience exchanged for affection, silence exchanged for temporary peace. That is not intimacy. That is leverage. Here is where the tension climbs. Once the initial rush fades, once the new supply's eyes stop shining quite as brightly, the narcissist begins to sense it. Not with humility, but with alarm. The praise becomes less frequent. The fascination becomes more ordinary. And ordinary is intolerable to a person who survives on worship. So the narcissist starts tightening invisible ropes. They seek reassurance in ways that look small at first, questions that are not questions, statements that are not statements, jokes with a blade inside them. And the new supply, often still dazzled, tries harder, explains more, gives more, smiles more. That effort briefly stabilizes the illusion. But the narcissist is not comforted by love. They are comforted only by control. And control always demands an increase. This is the crescendo most do not notice. The more they try to win the new supply, the more they reveal they are already losing themselves. Because persuasion is not peace. It is panic wearing perfume. It is fear dressed as confidence. And fear is a cruel master. It never says, "You have enough." It always says, "Prove it again." God's judgment often begins right there, not as lightning, but as exposure from within. When a person refuses truth, God may allow them to live inside the restlessness of their own deception. The mask becomes heavier, the story becomes harder to maintain, and the narcissist's inner world begins to turn on them like a house divided against itself. And when a person has to persuade themselves, the next thing you will notice is this: they begin to perform more than they live. Sign 2. They perform more than they live. Performance is the narcissist's shelter, but it is also their prison. This is the second crucial sign. The narcissist is already miserable with the new supply. They are acting far more than they are connecting. They are managing perception instead of building trust. They are curating moments instead of cultivating a shared life. Because real closeness requires the one thing they cannot tolerate being known. At first, the performance looks like strength. It looks like charm. It looks like confidence. But underneath it is a quiet terror. If you see the real me, you will leave. And so they keep the lights bright, the music loud, the gestures grand. They try to stay impressive, because impressive feels safer than honest. Here is where the pressure rises. The narcissist does not simply want affection. They want a reflection that never changes. They want the new supply to remain fascinated, grateful, and compliant. But human beings are not mirrors. A person gets tired. A person asks questions. A person eventually needs depth. And the moment the new supply begins to move from infatuation into discernment, the narcissist feels threatened, not because they are being mistreated, but because they are being seen. So the narcissist begins monitoring the room: tone, timing, attention, loyalty. They become sensitive to pauses. They interpret neutrality as disrespect. They treat boundaries like rebellion. And the more the new supply tries to be normal, to have an opinion, to need space, to say, "Not tonight," the more the narcissist experiences it as humiliation. This is the turning point. Their mask starts slipping, not by accident, but by exhaustion. The effort required to be perfect becomes unbearable. And when the effort becomes unbearable, the narcissist does what they always do. They make someone else pay for their inner lack. The warmth turns conditional. The affection becomes a reward system. The kindness starts arriving with fine print. The new supply is praised when they perform and punished when they don't. And now the relationship becomes a treadmill. The narcissist runs faster to keep the image alive, while the soul inside them grows more brittle. That brittleness is misery. Not always visible, not always loud, but it shows up in impatience, in sudden coldness, in an edge that appears without warning, because the performance is draining them and the truth is pressing in. Scripture speaks of the house built on sand. It may stand in fair weather. It may even look beautiful from the road. But storms do not create weakness, they reveal it. And when God allows reality to confront a counterfeit life, the narcissist finds out something terrifying. They cannot rest in what they have because they do not know how to be real. And once the performance starts to drain them, you will see the next sign. Their patience thins, their irritation rises, and the cracks begin to show. Sign 3. They become irritable, restless, and easy to trigger. When the performance starts to drain them, the first thing that disappears is patience. Not because the new supply suddenly did something terrible, but because the narcissist's inner world can no longer afford the cost of pretending. This is one of the most revealing signs the narcissist is already miserable with the new supply. Their irritation begins to surface more often, more sharply, and with less warning. At the beginning, they seem unusually attentive. They seem present. They seem almost gentle. But that tenderness is frequently not rooted in maturity. It is rooted in strategy, and strategies collapse the moment reality refuses to cooperate. Here is what happens behind the scenes. The narcissist expects the new supply to remain permanently impressed, permanently grateful, permanently available. But human beings are not designed to live as someone else's oxygen supply. Eventually, the new supply gets tired. Eventually, they have a bad day. Eventually, they ask a sincere question. Eventually, they say, "I need space." And the narcissist does not experience those moments as normal. They experience them as rejection. That is where the misery intensifies, because a narcissist often carries a deep, unspoken fear of being ordinary, of being seen and found, unimpressive, unworthy, replaceable. And when the new supply stops feeding the fantasy at the same intensity, that fear wakes up. It doesn't wake up as humility. It wakes up as agitation, as impatience, as a sharp edge in the voice, as a silent punishment, as a sudden coldness that leaves the other person trying to fix something they didn't break. This is the crescendo. Their need for control expands precisely because their inner life is shrinking. Proverbs speaks of a person who cannot rule their spirit being, like a city broken down without walls, and that is exactly what begins to show. The narcissist's emotional walls start failing. Small inconveniences feel like attacks. Neutral comments feel like disrespect. Boundaries feel like betrayal. Their reactions grow disproportionate because their inner stability was never real stability, it was stimulation. And in that instability, a quiet form of judgment is already at work, not because God delights in chaos, but because God is faithful to truth. When someone builds a life on image instead of integrity, God may allow that image to become harder and harder to maintain. The narcissist becomes haunted not by a ghost, but by the weight of their own emptiness. They grow restless even when nothing is wrong. They grow irritated even when they are getting what they wanted. That is misery with a clean outfit on. And when irritation becomes their new language, the past will not stay buried, it will start leaking into the present. Sign 4. They drag the past into the present. One of the clearest proofs that the narcissist is already miserable with the new supply is this: they cannot let yesterday die. They bring old conflicts into new conversations. They recycle old accusations in new situations. They keep a file of former enemies because they need someone to blame for the darkness they refuse to confront within themselves. They may speak of you directly, or they may speak in coded language: "My crazy ex, people who betrayed me, no one ever understood me." It can sound like vulnerability at first. It can sound like pain. But pay attention to what it produces. It does not produce humility. It produces loyalty tests. It produces division. It produces a new supply who feels pressured to take sides in a battle they never started. This is where the tension rises. The narcissist uses the past as a weapon to control the future. If they can make the new supply fear becoming the next villain, then the new supply stays compliant. They stay careful. They stay quiet. They try harder. And for a moment, the narcissist feels powerful again. But that power has a cost. Because every time they revive the past, they reveal something they cannot hide. They are not healed. They are not renewed. They are not building. They are repeating. And repetition is exhausting. Here is the turning point that exposes their misery. The new supply eventually senses the pattern. They begin to notice that every relationship story ends the same way, with the narcissist as the misunderstood victim and someone else as the monster. And even if the new supply doesn't say it out loud, a question forms in the atmosphere. If everyone before me was the problem, what does that make me when I finally disappoint you? That question is poison to the narcissist's fantasy, because fantasy requires innocence, no history, no accountability, no consequences. But the past carries receipts. And when the narcissist keeps pulling those receipts onto the table, they accidentally confess that they live in unresolved disorder. Scripture warns that the mouth speaks from the abundance of the heart. If the heart is full of resentment, resentment will spill out. If the heart is full of blame, blame will leak into every new beginning. And a person who will not face truth has no way to create peace, only temporary ceasefires. This is the climax. The new relationship becomes crowded with invisible people, old rivals, old grudges, old comparisons, old wounds. The new supply is not just dating the narcissist, they are inheriting a war. And the narcissist, no matter how loudly they smile, cannot be at rest while they are still fighting yesterday. That is misery. Not the misery of being punished by others, but the misery of being trapped by one's own inner disorder until God's reality presses in and the lie becomes too heavy to carry. And when the past is dragged into the present, they begin to need the outside world to confirm the lie. Sign 5. They need the outside world to confirm the lie. This is where the narcissist's misery becomes strangely visible, because they start borrowing stability from public perception. They do not merely want a relationship. They want a verdict. They want the world to agree that they are desirable, chosen, untouchable, and finally vindicated. And that craving is not confidence, it is insecurity looking for witnesses. So the overcompensation begins. Louder displays, bigger gestures, more proof. Not because love is overflowing, but because fear is. They are trying to drown out the quiet suspicion inside themselves that this relationship, like the last one, is built on something thin. There is a spiritual principle here that Scripture speaks to with uncomfortable clarity. When a person lives for the approval of people, they become enslaved to it. Jesus warned about doing holy things to be seen, not because visibility is always wrong, but because the heart that must be seen is rarely at rest, and the narcissist is never at rest because they are not anchored in truth. Here is where the tension rises. Once they depend on public confirmation, every fluctuation becomes a threat. A post that gets less attention, a moment where the new supply seems less enthusiastic, a comment from someone who questions the perfection. The narcissist begins to feel attacked by ordinary life. And because they cannot tolerate that feeling, they start tightening control behind closed doors. This is the crescendo. Their perfect image becomes a hungry machine that must be fed daily. The new supply is pulled into, maintaining it smile more, show more, reassure more, admire more. And when the new supply fails to keep the image inflated, the narcissist's mood turns. They become sharp, they become cold, they punish with silence. They punish with contempt disguised as humor. They punish with spiritual-sounding language that subtly shifts blame. You're too sensitive. You're not grateful. You're ruining something good. And that is the irony of divine order. The more they chase the appearance of joy, the more joy slips away. Because joy is not manufactured, it is received. It comes from integrity, an inner alignment between who you are and what you claim. But the narcissist's life is split, what they show and what they are, and that split is misery. They can decorate it, they can broadcast it, they can stage it, but they cannot heal it without surrender. and surrender is the one act they resist. And when the outside world becomes their lifeline, the relationship starts to hollow out because appearances cannot replace depth. Sign 6. Superficial steps, no real connection. This is the sixth crucial sign. The narcissist is already miserable with the new supply. They skip the slow, sacred work of genuine intimacy and replace it with spectacle. Expensive gifts, big trips, fast milestones, loud declarations, anything that looks like love without requiring the vulnerability that love demands. Because vulnerability is dangerous to them. Vulnerability invites questions. It invites accountability. It invites truth. And truth is the one atmosphere the narcissist cannot keep breathing in without choking on what they've hidden. So they keep everything on the surface beautiful, shiny, impressive. But surface-level living creates a quiet famine. The new supply eventually feels it. We do a lot, but we don't truly know each other. There are pictures, but there is no peace. There are events, but there is no safety. There is movement, but there is no maturity. Here is where the tension builds. The moment the new supply reaches for depth, the narcissist experiences it as a threat. Questions like, what do you really value? Why do you react that way? Can we talk about what happened? These are normal questions in a healthy bond. But for the narcissist, those questions feel like exposure, and exposure feels like shame, and shame feels like death. So the narcissist does what counterfeit lives always do when truth knocks. They evade, they deflect, or they erupt. This is the turning point. The relationship begins to revolve around avoiding reality. When the new supply asks for closeness, the narcissist offers distraction. When the new supply asks for consistency, the narcissist offers charm. When the new supply asks for honesty, the narcissist offers anger. And slowly, the new supply learns a painful lesson. The connection was never built to hold weight, only to hold an image. Now the climax. Eventually, the new supply sees the gap between the public version and the private version. And that gap is terrifying, because it means the person they thought they knew is not fully there. It is like embracing something that looks human from a distance, but has no warmth when you get close. And when that realization lands, the narcissist becomes even more miserable, because they can feel the admiration slipping, and admiration is what they used as proof that they were safe. Scripture speaks of foundations. A house can look fine for a season, but when pressure comes, what matters is what cannot be photographed, what is underneath. And when a relationship is built on appearance, pressure does not destroy something strong. Pressure reveals something hollow. So now the narcissist is trapped. They cannot create depth without humility, and they cannot tolerate humility without losing the illusion of superiority. That inner contradiction is misery, and when depth is avoided long enough, the narcissist will begin testing limits, because control feels safer than closeness. Sign 7. Early devaluation is self-sabotage. This is the seventh crucial sign the narcissist is already miserable with the new supply. The devaluation begins early, not always as shouting, not always as obvious cruelty. Often it arrives as small things, late arrivals without apology, jokes that sting, little corrections meant to shrink the other person, subtle criticism delivered with a smile. And if you've lived through it, you know how it works. The wound is real, but the narcissist insists it wasn't a wound at all. Here is why this matters. A healthy person builds trust by protecting boundaries. A narcissist tests boundaries because boundaries remind them they are not God, and they cannot tolerate that reminder. At first, these tests feel like the narcissist checking compatibility. But the truth is darker. They are measuring how much disrespect the new supply will swallow without leaving. They are searching for a partner who will accept diminishing treatment and still remain grateful. That is not love, that is training. The tension rises because the new supply, still hoping the golden season will return, often responds the way many good people respond. They explain, they soften, they adjust, they give benefit of the doubt, they try to keep peace. But the narcissist does not interpret grace as grace. They interpret it as permission. So the testing increases, the tone hardens, the kindness becomes conditional. The warmth turns into a faucet the narcissist controls on when they want loyalty, off when they want dominance. And now the relationship becomes a spiritual pressure chamber. The new supply begins living in a constant state of uncertainty, trying to read moods, trying to avoid triggering punishment, trying to earn safety that should never need to be earned. Now the climax, because this is where the narcissist's misery exposes itself. They cannot tolerate a partner who has dignity. If the new supply pushes back, the narcissist often panics and discards them quickly because resistance threatens control. But if the new supply does not push back, the narcissist grows contemptuous because compliance feels boring and boredom awakens the emptiness they keep trying to outrun. Either path leads to collapse. This is why early devaluation is self-sabotage. The narcissist is trapped in a contradiction. They crave admiration, but they destroy the very person who could offer healthy love. They crave intimacy, but they punish vulnerability. They want devotion, but they demand it through fear, and fear never produces real devotion, only temporary surrender. Scripture describes the fruit of a life. A corrupt tree cannot bear good fruit. It may hang ornaments for a season, but the nature underneath does not change. And this is often how God's judgment unfolds, not by instantly striking the person down, but by allowing the hidden nature to bear visible consequences. The narcissist's own impulses, control, contempt, domination, become the very tools that ruin their new beginning. And once devaluation begins, the next sign follows quickly. They start envying the very person they chose. Sign 8. They envy the very person they chose. This is the 8th crucial sign. The narcissist is already miserable with the new supply. The new supply's strengths become the narcissist's torment. What they initially admired, kindness, confidence, competence, independence, sincerity, begins to feel like an accusation. Not because the new supply is attacking them, but because the narcissist cannot stand being near something real when they live by imitation. At first, the narcissist loves those qualities because they can use them. Empathy means forgiveness. Independence means resources. Success means status. Warmth means someone who will keep trying. But then a frightening truth emerges. The very qualities that make the new supply valuable also make them harder to control. And that is where misery deepens into something sharper, because the narcissist does not only want a partner, they want a hierarchy. They want to remain the sun while the other person orbits. But if the new supply shines, if they are respected, capable, spiritually grounded, emotionally steady, the narcissist feels eclipsed. And being eclipsed is intolerable to a pride-driven soul. Here is the tension. Envy doesn't always show up as jealousy. Sometimes it shows up as criticism. The narcissist begins to correct the new supply's confidence. They mock their convictions. They minimize their achievements. They treat their goodness as naive. They look for ways to reduce what they cannot replicate. This is the turning point. The narcissist begins to resent the new supply for having what the narcissist refuses to build. The new supply may have peace because they have integrity. They may have stability because they tell the truth. They may have genuine relationships because they do not feed on people, they love people. And the narcissist, who survives on extraction, cannot understand why peace doesn't come to them the same way. Now the climax. Envy creates a desire to ruin, not always publicly, often privately through subtle undermining, emotional whiplash, and slow erosion. The narcissist would rather break what is good than admit they need to change. And this is where divine judgment becomes painfully precise. God may allow the narcissist to become trapped in the consequences of their own envy. They wanted the new supply as a trophy, but now the trophy reminds them of their inner poverty. They wanted someone strong enough to elevate their image, but now that strength threatens their control. They wanted someone kind enough to endure, but now that kindness exposes their cruelty. So the narcissist becomes miserable in a way that cannot be posted. Miserable because the new supply is not a cure. Miserable because the new supply is a mirror. Miserable because no matter how far they run, the same truth follows them. The problem is not the person beside them. The problem is the person within them. And when envy reaches its peak, the final realization begins to form. The new supply cannot save them from themselves.